Live streaming is on.
Hello, Global Theater. My name is Gerry Fialka, and it is June 13, 2020. Thank you, Clinton
21.
Nichols. Wait a minute. I thought I was going to get it right. Thank God we got Clinton. Not only does he know not only does he know what button to push, he knows how to correct me when my brain goes, great God, panning. So today is June 13, 2021. We want to thank Clinton Ignatoff for being so dang smart. Thank you, Clinton. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Brian Chidester. Brian, please pronounce your last name so we know how to pronounce it right.
Chidester is the easiest,
Chidester.
but it's a derivative of Chichester, which means key is Christian and Chester means settler. So they were Celtic settlers in the middle of England.
Oh, cool. What a great thing to know the history of your last name. So, Brian, what's the best thing for a human being?
To love and be loved in return.
Oh my God, is that the greatest line? Do you know that my wife Susie and I have that on our wedding invitation? Probably because you bringing it to our attention. I mean, that is an amazing thing to love and be loved in return. What's your favorite? Go ahead.
My grandmother actually wrote it to my parents in their wedding book in 1975, and I wasn't born, and I absolutely knew nothing about Nature Boy or that line or anything about the composer until way later. And only recently did I pull out their wedding book, and I was going through it, and my grandmother wrote this inscription in the front, and it said, "The greatest thing you'll ever learn is just to love and be loved in return." She didn't put it in quotes. She just acted like it was kind of her sage advice, but I thought that was really cool and beautiful and serendipitous too. Like maybe in some way I was meant to kind of fulfill that part of their vow or that part of their blessing. So
it is truly an amazing sentiment for what you taught me was in your recent talk. The three proto hippies are Harry Smith, Harry Parch, and Moondog. But Eden Abez is how I pronounce his name. How do you pronounce it?
Abbey, Eden Abbey. The Z is silent.
Eden Abbey is really not the first proto hippie. What do you call him?
I'm not so much into categories or nomenclature or things like that. I think that he's kind of a contemporary of Moondog, Harry Parch, and Harry Smith. They all were interested in esoteric subjects, and they all lived outdoors at a time and hot freight trains and things like that. So I think of them as sort of existing simultaneously and parallel. But the reason why I would call them proto hippies is not because they look the part. I mean, the part of proto hippies goes back to the Old Testament prophets, or all these Greek wise sages that had beards and togas and sandals. And I think that kind of philosophical human being living close to nature with these spiritual tendencies is something that exists for all of human history. I think hippie to me connotates like you look like that and you think like that, but you also have some sort of artistic medium that you're expressing yourself in, because the hippies were really known for being, like an artistic movement, as much as just like a look and a spiritual thing. And so Smith was a poet. He was also a historian. He was also a painter. And then the other guys, they were all musicians. And what I like about them also is that all of them were kind of in some way like contemporary artists. They, the most interesting thing about them was their persona, because they all adopted a persona. So I would say that Eden Abbey, or Eden Abez, or just Abbey, however you want to refer to him, was one of the proto hippies that was around in the 1930s and 40s, like Moondog and Harry Parch and Harry Smith. But he was in a different location. Abbey was in Los Angeles. And I think that in a way kind of sets him apart, because his music does have more of that kind of proto-California psychedelic element than the other guys does.
Yeah. Well, that was good. We were supposed to talk about you, but right away we delved into who you study and work. You know, we're looking so forward to your documentary on Eden and all your music releases. So back to you, Brian. What's your favorite form of information? How it comes into you?
Well, I've been practicing Tibetan Buddhism for over 20 years, very seriously for 8 years. So I get a lot of my information by osmosis. I meditate at least once a day, sometimes twice a day. And although some people think I have a photographic memory because I'm a historian and I do documentaries and curation and archival projects and whatnot, I only can really remember material when I actually am using it. So if I have a fact here and I have a fact there, the memorization process really comes when I start to apply it. And then, you know, as I'm walking around, that alchemical process happens where something that wasn't there in my brain all of a sudden appears in my brain. And I really wait for those kind of revelations to appear before I actually start to work in a creative or historical manner. You know, the most important thing for me, I think, is revelation.
Wow. That is so important. You evoke so much. We have a common interest in Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, and Joyce said, "Epiphanies in everydayness." So, you know, you can stub your toe or read a book or listen to the greatest music ever and have an epiphany. But it's also, you got to be aware you can have an epiphany in everydayness. And Joyce got a lot from Wyndham Lewis, who said artists live in the present and write a detailed history of the future, which sounds so cosmic, but it's basically, you know how to live, be here now. Why, Brian, why do humans collect or gather information?
Well, I can't speak for all of the human race. The reason why I collect or gather information myself is because I am trying to attain enlightenment. I am trying to attain wisdom, and in my spiritual practice, trying to break the karmic cycle and reach a state of ultimate transcendence, which I believe all people will ultimately. So, in that way, collecting information is a pathway to wisdom and a pathway to enlightenment. That's, for me, that's the ultimate goal. That's why I do all the things that I do. So my projects in particular, being creative is sort of my talent or my gift in the world. And so I really use the opportunities I have to create things in order to go through sort of a liminal process where I'm in one state, or I find something of a historical value in one state. It's maybe deteriorating, or maybe I find something historical in the Library of Congress. And I go through that alchemical process of actually bringing it into the world, which is something of a transcendental process for me. And then I hope that when people hear the albums, the archival albums that I produce, or watch the films that I direct, that they're able to also have that kind of feeling of a transformation in their minds. You know, for me, transformation, walking through that gateway, the path to wisdom and enlightenment, these are the most important things that I think a human can aspire to. And as far as an artist, those are the things that I'm most drawn to, that idea of transformation.
Really well put. You know, Brian, you're really coming through well. You're articulate. The sound is perfect on this Zoom. It feels like we're right next to each other, and we are. So is this need or desire to collect information more innate in humans or more invented?
I can't speak for all human beings. For me, I was creating from the time I was 2 or 3. I had a really vast imagination, but I didn't grow up in a cultured family. We were a working class family. Most of my family lived in Philadelphia or Wilmington, Delaware, the two big cities in that area. And all of my relatives were either homemakers or union workers in factories or whatnot. So I didn't grow up around culture. I never went to a museum when I was little. My access to culture was basically television, horror movies, comic books, and record albums. So, you know, I think it's always been really important for me to use my creativity as a way of expanding consciousness. And I didn't know that when I was little, but I was very inventive as a kid. I started making videos in my parents' basement when I was 8, mimicking politicians. Actually, I did that when I was 5 years old. I was on stage in kindergarten mocking Ronald Reagan. And I know that a lot of people have forgotten all of the things that happened during the Reagan Bush years now that we've gone Trump, but I haven't. I still consider these guys to be have left a really terrible mark upon our society. And I was really happy that one of my earliest performances was to lampoon Ronald Reagan.
Yeah,
and it was on his watch that 500,000 people died of AIDS. So,
yeah, Brian, I salute you. This is good. But when I ask you these general questions, I know you're putting them in your personal Brian universe. That's good. But I mean your hunch.
okay.
Your hunch. Do you think this need or want to collect information is more innate or more invented? Just, your sort of impulse, intuition. Like,
well, we're hunter-gatherers in our origin. Civilization
right.
is what, 3,000 or 4,000 years old, so probably collecting is
Yeah.
somewhat innate. It's a part of the collective unconscious, I guess.
Yeah. Now,
how else do we survive if we don't collect information and food?
right. No, that's good. Now, on that term you just brought up, does the brain more detect consciousness or create consciousness? Is consciousness there just bubbling away and we're detecting it, or are we creating it?
Well, there's such a thing as the unified field that scientists talk a lot about. And the deeper you go in the subatomic levels, you realize, or at least the hypothesis is that all things are interconnected in a way that's not visible to the naked eye. But in meditation practice, which I've been doing for more than half my life, we actually use various techniques since you can't walk into the unified field at a mental level, we actually use meditation to access the unified field of all consciousness. So I think, for me, it's something that is there and it's shared between all sentient beings. But since we experience time in a linear fashion, it seems also that we discover that we are in the process of discovery and that we are active agents. So I think it's simultaneously we're kind of gathering information by osmosis, things that we all share, things that are sort of written into the code. This is just my theory, but I also think like experientially it feels a lot like education.
Yeah.
And so I think when you take away the spiritual aspect, and I don't mean to be such a spiritual mumbo jumbo person right out of the box, I think when you take away the spiritual access, you're left with this kind of education process, which does feel like it has this real strong pull, this necessity in our society. And yet, part of me also, feels very strongly that there's limitation to education and legislation in terms of solving problems of a social and spiritual nature. Our world's in a lot of trouble, and I don't think that we can educate our way out of it. I think you got to go deep, and you can't go much deeper than the unified field of all consciousness, Gerry.
That was really well put. Do thoughts create emotions?
Well, some of these abstract questions are things that I never really think about too much, to be honest with you. I could give you my personal opinion, but to me, it's sort of like what came first, the chicken or the egg?
Right. Yeah, but it's
So
not, we're just using the questions as jumping off points. So you don't have to quote answer the question. But I'm just saying, let's word it this way. Just in your observation of humans, are humans more thinking beings or more feeling beings? I know it's both and you can't separate it. But what's your hunch? What's your observation? People are a little more thinking or a little more feeling?
I think thinking.
Do you really? Wow, that's heavy. Yeah.
I'm
So
not a Freudian. I'm also not a pessimist. I actually believe that we could trust the electorate. I believe we could trust the working class and the poor to make their own decisions. I don't think we have to shove advertising down their throats. I don't think we have to try to give them things that feed their worst impulses. I actually think that humans are more self-sacrificial, loving, giving, and intelligent than the government or the establishment or the system gives us credit for. I think when you give somebody the ability to think for themselves, to decide for themselves, to be trusted with decisions, to be trusted to sacrifice, they actually can surprisingly deliver in ways that the system cannot possibly anticipate. And so therefore you have all of these scientific positivists coming after Freud who have looked at human impulses as being inherently dark and untrustworthy. And so therefore it makes sense that everything from our science and our health to our politics has this sort of pessimistic quality where we're just fed a lot of garbage that we don't need. Our wants and needs, as Robinson Jeffers said so eloquently in one of his poems, are no more changed in 10,000 years than the beaks of eagles.
what a beautiful thing to quote. Say the poet's name one more time.
Robinson Jeffers.
Robinson Jeffers. Thank you for that. I love people who quote poets. We need more poetry in our lives. That was beautiful. And so do you more pursue meaning? There's not a lot of these more or either or, but there's a couple off the bat. So
It's okay.
no sweat. Do you more pursue meaning or more pursue happiness?
Well, I have both qualities. I consider myself quite a decadent person, and a big part of my practice is embracing the chaos within and letting happen what will happen and not try to control it too much. But at the same time, uh, I'm open to uh, doing what needs to be done with the information that comes my way, I guess you could say. So.
Yeah. So to quote another poet, Audre Lorde, she said, you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Yvonne Rainer responded and says, you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest?
For exposing
Well, she says for dismantling the master's house. But I generally say for anything. What new tool do you suggest? But I set it up with that, so it's sort of implied. You can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. And then Yvonne said you can if you expose the tools. So it's really just a question of what new tool do you suggest? And you put in the context you want.
Well, for me, meditation has always been
Yeah.
my gateway to transcendental experiences, to creativity, to unlimited bliss. So I'm also a prodigious walker. I also really advocate reading stuff that is outside of the canon. I am big on listening to both sides of both media sources, and also a lot of media sources that are not corporately funded. So those are some of the pathways that I would take towards dismantling the master's house. I would love to actually see the master's house burned completely down to the ground. And the only reason why I don't advocate absolute anarchy in my day-to-day thinking or my speaking engagements or the things that I work on is because I think there would be too much death. But I'm fully willing to acknowledge the fact that nature at some point will do the work of its own accord. And so therefore I don't really need to advocate that. The opposite is that we all become extremely conscious and get into the flow of nature in a way that absolves us of a lot of these things that we find to be so important, that we can actually, maybe in some ways coexist in a way that makes more sense. I don't particularly myself, for instance, find civilization to be all that sane. And so maybe that's why I don't have such a open fear of rural people or what lies beyond where the trail ends. I think a lot of our horror, our modern horror, is based on actually this urban fear of rural people and and of nature. And I don't really share that with my urban confreres, if that makes
Wow,
sense.
that makes a lot of sense. And I love how concise you were about a list of very feasible tools to utilize. And I loved all of them, but I especially love walking. Just walking, you can learn a lot, feel a lot, see your neighborhood. Thank you. So, what do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
I worry about my dad. He currently has prostate cancer and he's going through radiation, but I'm trying to give him some naturopathic tips. I worry that the people in my life don't know how much I love them. I worry that if my house catches fire, that I won't be able to get my dog out in time. But, by and large, by the time I go to bed, I'm not really that worried. I usually take my day to be pretty creative and exhaust all of the fears that start out in the beginning of the day. And I'm lucky, Gerry, because for 21 years now, I've made a living as a creative person. And I know that's not easy to do for a lot of people. And there have been tough times for me. I've lived really, really hand to mouth many times. And also when I finished big projects and I was in between one project and trying to figure out where to go with the next, in that space between the thing that defined you and the thing that you'll be defined by next, you're nothing. And you can really hit rock bottom emotionally and also in terms of making money and the unfortunate things that we have to go through in that regard. So, that's those are things that I have worried about in the past, but I tend to try to work through them creatively through the day and really use my creative aspect to dig deeper and try to overcome some fears and difficulties. I love being creative, It's the only thing I think I really live for in my life personally.
Brian, that was well put. And it inspires me. Paul Schrader said the role of the artist is to attempt to sell out but fail. And I think, you're staying true to your vision, and that's the beautiful thing. And everything will work out. It doesn't matter because you are staying true to your loves and what you feel is worth pursuing.
Well,
And
early on, I did give in and tried to fit into what various producers or editors or whatnot were asking me to do. And I found that I was failing at that. And if you can fail doing something that you're not, that you don't feel good about, then what's the difference between failing in something that you actually really do feel good about or that you really love? So if there's no difference at all, then you might as well try to do the thing that you love.
well put. Can you conjure up your earliest memory ever or one of them?
I have a memory of being bathed in a plastic tub by my mother when I was maybe 3 or 4 months old. I have a memory before I was 1 of crawling around in my Aunt Florence's Victorian house outside of Baltimore. And I only know that because she died before I was 1, and I can remember her. She was in Better House and Gardens in the 1940s, and she actually built a labyrinth on the property. And when she died, my grandfather inherited it, and I spent a lot of time going into that labyrinth and dreaming. And maybe that's where I first met Pan and some of the nymphs and some of the gods of lore that I feel I've carried in my spirit all my life, and have been really kind of the gatekeepers to the realm of creativity that I've been able to access over and over when I need it.
Ryan, Lord Buckley used to hang out at the Venice West, which
Yeah.
turned into Sponto Gallery, and I was so proud to have you put on events there, and was honored. And Lord Buckley has a great line to apply. He says, "People are flowers, and it's an honor to be able to stroll in your garden." So it's like it's an honor to be strolling in these thoughts of labyrinths and where the origins of some of your beautiful thinking. So is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
Well, I don't really think in terms of blessings and curses or good or bad or binary. I think everything can be a gateway to transcendence, and sometimes your greatest fears are your greatest teachers. And so, a lot of times we get stuck with the clouds that are just above us. But, if you can actually look beyond the clouds, it goes on to infinity. And so, particularly in meditation, one of the things that we really try to do is not fight off negative emotions or not fight off fears, but to invite them in so that we can learn from them. So yeah, for me, the kind of binary thinking that is taught to us, in the media and in psychology and in all that, is not something that I really put a lot of premium on. I love chaos. I love the darkness. The great god Pan, as we talked about earlier, was kind of the blueprint for Lucifer. And I don't really, I consider Lucifer to be a major component of my thinking as well, for the fact that I don't think I would really be happy in the Garden of Eden. I don't think I would. I don't think I could exist in a place where there wasn't some kind of turmoil or some kind of chaos. For me, going through the process of difficulty and fear, or in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which I study, manifestations of monsters and demons, all of that's part of keeping focus on your inner light and following your inner light. I don't think you can really understand your bliss until you faced your fears. So I don't know if that makes sense.
That made a lot of sense. And it also reminded me about a reading club I attend every week through once a week through Sweeney's Pharmacy in Dublin, and we read Dante's Inferno
Mm.
in Italian and in English, and it is so funny because all these people are from all over the world, and they're all going, hell's a lot more exciting than heaven. And I mean, they basically don't say it that simple, but it's sort of like what you said. It's what I learned from Frank Zappa is embrace contradiction, embrace these down, flips your breakdowns into breakthroughs. So Brian, tell me just briefly, someone in your immediate family who had an impact on you, sort of like a role model, and what was that impact specifically? And then outside your immediate family, someone who had an impact on you, and what specifically was the impact?
Well, two people in my family were probably the most seminal in terms of the way of my thinking are my grandmother on my mother's side, because she was so decisive and she didn't put on airs. And so I really loved talking to her because she knew how to make her mind up about things. Um, and her priorities were always, she had lived through the Great Depression, and she sort of became the matriarch of our family. And there was a lot of problems with her siblings and her parents being divorced, and it was an abusive family. And I always just admired how when she made her mind up, you couldn't take her off of it. And then the other one is my father. We are politically on opposite ends. I'm leftist and more Marxist, and he's capitalist and conservative. But one thing I really admire about him a lot is he's very analytical, and he doesn't really get caught up in the details of things. And I like that myself a lot. I can really memorize a lot of things when I need to, but I really like to delegate those kind of things out. And when they come back to me through somebody else's filter, then I love the process of reworking and listening until something reveals itself. For me, revelation is everything. I think if you listen, a thing will tell you what it needs, but you can't force it, and you really have to listen. And so everything that I do creatively, whether it's writing books or articles, making films, or working on albums like the one that we are hopefully talk a little bit about today, it's all, I wait until something tells me what it wants to be. And I think my dad really had that sensibility. And he also introduced me to the Andy Griffith Show. And that really had a big influence on me because even though my dad was conservative, I think he recognized that Andy was also kind of a progressive in a way, in that all these country bumpkins would, run into each other, and he would have to deal with their problems because none of them really wanted to modernize. And Andy was able to tell them, you can maintain some of the traditions that are important to you in Mayberry, but at the same time, like, we can hear each other out in a more enlightened and open-minded way. And so to me, that was really kind of a great thing to have in my life, because I didn't have much culture growing up. My culture was basically, baseball and going to theme parks and piers, and going to the shore in Jersey every summer, and staying at my grandparents' trailer, and watching horror movies, and reading comic books. I never went to a museum. I never even read a book until I was 18, and now I've authored 8 of them. So it's, the things that I learned from my grandfather, or from my grandmother and my dad and many other people in my family, but those two especially really helped me out when I became more, I don't know, culturally astute or exposed to culture. A lot of those lessons I learned early on were super seminal. As far as somebody in my life who had a big influence on me, that is not a family member, um, I mean, the first one that I can think of is our mutual friend Dominic Priori. When I was 18, I was a freshman in college, and a friend of mine, a fellow Beach Boys fan, introduced me to the music of Eden Abez, who I've now done so much work on. And he gave me a Xerox of Eden and Brian Wilson in the studio during the Smile sessions in 1967. And then he introduced me to Dominic. And Dominic at that time was also interested in Eden and was interested in a lot of esoteric music that sort of bridged the gap between the beatnik 50s and the hippie psychedelic 60s. And so he was just such a vast pool of knowledge. And here I was, and basically an uneducated 18-year-old kid from the Philadelphia area, just dying to get out to the West Coast and learn more about Phil Spector and the Beach Boys and the hippies and psychedelia and love and the Doors. And Dominic just allowed me to sort of soak all that up. And he was, you know, even though he was more than 15 years older than me, he was super encouraging and always was willing to bring me on in projects. And he recognized that I was really hungry at that age. And he was a good friend to take me seriously, even though I had no experience. So I would say Dominic had a massive influence on my artistic career or process or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, well, this is well put, because I met Dominic first, and so you two really blended as a team and enlightened a lot of people at events that I produced with you, and I was always so honored that you did. Now, did your parents raise you a particular religion?
I was baptized Methodist, but we didn't really practice any religion. My mom's side was basically Irish Catholic or Irish American and Catholic, and my dad's side was Methodist. Um, and I had a children's book of Bible stories that were sort of reduced down to kind of like a literary form, but I only remember my mom reading to me the story of Jonah and the whale and the story of Daniel and the lion's den and about what happens at the end of Revelation when the lion lays down with the lamb. So I had that. And then my best friend when I was little was from Trinidad. And I had also in our class, we had a couple kids who were Muslim and one girl who was Jewish, and they would put on demonstrations of religion. And it always fascinated me, but we didn't really have it in my house. I would say that our religion was the Andy Griffith Show and Gilligan's Island and the Munsters and things like that. And nature. I loved following butterflies around the neighborhood. I loved catching turtles. And so I didn't really grow up. I would say, no, I didn't really grow up with a religion, but I was exposed because of where I lived to other spiritual practices, or I just thought of them really as traditions or stories. I didn't really have a concept of the afterlife or anything like that. When I was 4, I had an experience in my parents' backyard that was really horrific, and it dispelled the idea of the afterlife for me for a while, because I had a boxer turtle that I loved and he died, and then I buried him in the dirt. And because of those stories that my mom had in that children's Bible, I thought that he would come back to life if I buried him. But then I dug him up 6 months later, and the shell was filled with all of these blue worms that were feeding on the carcass. And then they jumped out of the shell at me, and I, fell back on my back, and then I ran into my parents' house and I cried. And then that was how I basically learned what happens to things after they die. So it took a long time for me to be interested in spiritual things. I was more interested, I think, growing up in baseball and using my parents' video camera and girls and things like that. So I was not really interested in spirituality, and I wasn't interested particularly in organized religion,
Yeah.
and nobody that I grew up with ever forced that on me. So I was really grateful for that. But I did have a brief religious experience when I was 18. I had taken LSD twice when I was 17, and that really was like the most beautiful experience I ever had, but I was not ready for it. And the first time I took it, I was just with 3 friends, and they put the drops on the sugar cubes, and we all put it in our mouths, and then we went to Denny's. And at Denny's, they were just, it was just a normal night at Denny's. People were smoking in the smoking section, and they had classical music on or whatever. And I had no idea what was going to happen. I'd only smoked grass up to that point. And then all of a sudden, out of the speakers, it seemed like there was this kind of geometry that was forming around the waves, and it almost felt like a banana or a tree was growing out, and I could actually see the sound waves and the chords sort of forming this information. And then I just had the most unbelievably beautiful experience beyond description. And I know that people say that there are bad trips, or they have all this propaganda against it, but I can't imagine that. To me, it was pure euphoria, but it was so advanced what I was seeing, and I had no real reference for what I would for opening up those kind of channels in my brain, which it felt like I was using more like 50% of my brain than the 10% they say we use day to day. But things were just coming at me, and they were the most euphoric and beautiful and epic things I had ever thought or experienced. And then I was really searching for something, but I didn't come from a background where anybody could say, oh yeah, go listen to Zappa, or go, on this kind of pilgrimage. The only thing that was really available in my world was like, Catholicism or Christianity. And my best friend in high school, who I played baseball with, his dad was a preacher, and he suggested that we go to this Christian rock festival. And so I went to that, and then I became born again for maybe 9 months, but because I was just looking for anything that was cosmic, and that was the only thing that was there. I just couldn't find it anywhere else. But then, interestingly enough, like I started really getting into psychedelic music, and I found this book at a used bookstore my freshman year of college. And when I saw the figure on that, I was in the throes of all of this really dark kind of conservatism and the weird side of Christianity. It was no longer cosmic like it had been at that rock festival, but it was really like dogmatic and restrictive. And then when I saw this figure with the circle, the halo behind him, and the peaceful look, I just said, I got to know what that is. I was so intrigued by the image, and I always loved when I was making videos to have something symmetrical. I always loved when people were sitting cross-legged and there was a circle, or there were columns on the sides. And so that idea that within the chaotic world we can find inner peace, it ripped my head off, Gerry. And at that moment, I just bought the book, and then I started going to Buddhist temple. And at first, I used to fall asleep a lot during meditation, and the people who were there, they would get really mad. But the gurus, or the actual leaders, they would always say, "Don't get mad at him. He needed to sleep." And so,
Nice. So well put, Brian. You are a great storyteller. That I was so swooped into that, so intriguing. But tell me, it's called Introducing Buddha. The book's author is who?
Jane Hope and Boren Van Loon. It's really not a great book. It's just a great cover.
Right, but it's the one that was a jumping off point for you. Now,
No, I didn't read it. I just bought it for the cover.
cover, I see. Well, even
After that, I read my first book. After that, it was Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury.
Right.
Imagine I'm 18 and I've never read a book in my life. I mean, I could read, but I
know what you're saying. That's great.
Just never sat down and read a book. And then when I read Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury, that really became such a gateway for so many thoughts. I mean, I just all of a sudden, like, I was thinking visually, words took on a new quality for me, because all of a sudden I was thinking, like, what if I was to use those words? Could I actually create like some kind of world that like he created? Because it just seems so visceral to me.
Yeah.
And so words had a new premium for me that I never thought they would up to that point.
You're a wordsmith indeed. If God exists, what would you want God to tell you after you die?
What would I want God to tell me? That in breaking all of his rules, I found my own way.
Wow, that is brilliant. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
I don't really believe in the whole concept. I just think it's all energy.
Yeah. How do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? I'm going to set this one up with a few modern thinkers' thoughts. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Fellini says, I need an enemy. Coppola, stole from the mob and the samurais. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK says, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. So the basic question, Brian, is how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you address the Alan Watts thought? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
It's very close to what Krishnamurti said, which was no man is another man's enemy. And I hold that to be dear. I witness a lot of violence here in New York. I've and I'm non-violent myself, but I do break up fights whenever I see them happening. What was the second question again?
Well, the question is basically, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy?
Turn the other cheek.
Yeah.
Non-violence. I am. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's like what James Brown said, either you go MLK or you go Malcolm X. MLK says someone hits you, don't hit him back. Malcolm X says if someone hits you, you can hit him back. So, it's turn the other cheek. It's like, why feed into it? Anyways, I agree. I try to be a pacifist as well. And it's something I think that everyone should aspire to. And turn the other cheek is great. Great
well,
response.
I don't think that we can fight our way to peace.
Yeah.
You have to believe in peace for peace sake.
Yeah. Lenny Bruce has a great one. He said, you can call cops 3 things: police officers, pigs, or peace officer. You can call them police, pigs, or peace officer. Well, Blake says it. We become what we behold. Why don't you just call them peace officers? So then they're invoking peace instead of, other types of words. So,
well, they're there to serve and protect, but they serve the interest of the propertied.
yeah.
And so, I really just try to stay out of the way of the police. Although I'm not a target of theirs, I have to say
Right.
that For 21 years, I carried marijuana on my body every day, and not once was I harassed. And so, and it's because of what color I am, unequivocally. And so, the police is not an entity in our country or in our world that I have to give much thought to because of the way that I was born. But at the same time, I instinctively understand that who they're serving and protecting starts with those who are propertied, and it goes down from there. So,
well put. It's real. What you said is real,
defund
bro.
the police.
Yeah, I agree. Reform, defund, whatever. We can do something. We can get better. We can strive for better. So James Joyce is the first projectionist over 100 years ago in Dublin, Volta Cinema. He basically checked out. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, Faulkner said, sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Well, it's a good question, Gerry. I would say that, the creative impulse has a lot to do with our separation from nature in general. Once civilizations started to form, and things such as currency and materials began to be accumulated, our access to our most basic and natural impulses, our primordial way of life, was wiped out. And so, in a way, I think all of our art, our culture, especially our music, is a way of kind of recreating nature in a way in which we can experience a kind of simulacrum of it. Like, if you go really deep into nature and you spend some days in nature, you don't really need to hear music at all. It's just this unbelievable symphony around you. And then, I did this a few years ago. When you actually come back into civilization, it's really hard when you get in the car to put on, like, rock and roll, or it's like you can start with really light jazz, and then, within a few days you can kind of work yourself back up to listening to, Led Zeppelin or Cream or whatever, or Creedence. But, at first I think it's really, really difficult because you're tuned into the rhythms of nature, and it's the most beautiful symphony you could ever imagine. And so I think, in a way, I think you're right that our creative aspect is our way of recreating nature, or in some ways dealing with the loss of our more primitive state, trying to understand it, maybe even trying to re-access it through the creative process. And so, I particularly with Dharmaland, the album that I produced of music by Eden Abbey, which has been sort of one of my lifelong pursuits. My whole goal was to use art as a gateway to the experience of nature and the experience of transcendence. So there is a lot of kind of pop surrealism on there. There are a lot of what I would call magic instruments that historically in myth were used to sort of transport you from one state of consciousness to the other. And I think that our loss of connection to nature has left us with the need to artistically create something that opens up those channels again and makes us feel wild and decadent and and more intellectually and spiritually free.
Wow, you really evoked biomimicry, which I've recently been turned on to through Carolyn Casey. And it's like how humans, the person who invented Velcro saw how plants did this. And then they made, and in this train was coming out of this tunnel in Japan, and all the windows would break in the buildings. And they were like, what can we do? And they studied this kingfisher bird, how it went through, and they go, just do it the nature way. And it's like we turn it, and then it's Messiaen, the composer. He just hears the birds and he goes, oh, I can write like music like that. So it's called biomimicry, and it was so enlightening to learn about it, because McLuhan said that technology, anything we invent, is the most human thing, and that it extends some humanness. So it's almost like we're biomimicking not only animals and plants, but ourselves. So we invent a shutter for a projector or a camera because we extend our eyelid. So, we invent clothing because it extends our skin. And so, knife and fork extends our teeth. So what does the writing utensil extend for you? You've published books, whether it's a keyboard or a pencil, a writing utensil. What does a writing tool extend for you? What humanness?
Memory.
Yeah.
It allows memory to take physical form. That's the most important thing that I try to do when I write. I consider myself not a historian so much as a creative historian. I'm looking for connections between things that will then reveal something else that isn't seen from the objects themselves. And I spend a lot of time actually waiting for things to reveal themselves, things that I've collected, things that I've researched. So for me, the act of writing is it's an act of magic. Actually the word spell, to cast a spell, actually means to just spell something. Or grimoire, which is a spell book, is actually a derivative of grammar. And so what we're doing when we write or when we speak is we're actually manifesting something from some part of the recesses of our minds, or something that's collectively shared into the world. And so we're actually, playing a vital role in nature. Now, of course, when thoughts become too homogenized, they actually begin to have the adverse effect. Nature never repeats itself in a way where it defaults backwards, which is what we are trying to do when we create sort of cultural homogeneity. There are only a few books that are actually coming out on this in the last 20, 30 years, but several scientists have looked deeply into this idea of, is nature actually defaulting back to its original state, or as something changes, is it moving forward and then adapting to this new state? And if that's the case, then it doesn't make sense that we're sort of setting up these standards, whether they're critical or cultural standards or educational standards or political standards, from which we are expecting everyone, once they've gone out, to then default back to. No, if we were really mimicking nature, which I believe we are, then every time there's a new right turn or a left turn, we would have to reinvent ourselves in light of that. So the idea of having any kind of standards by which to measure things on, to me, is completely counter to nature. And that's why I don't put any stock in literary or critical canons. I put very little stock in the education system. My feeling is, Gerry, we're in a lot of trouble in this world And I don't think that we can educate or legislate ourselves out of it. I think you got to go much deeper than that. And you can't go much deeper than the unified field of all consciousness. So when people dive in and they access the deep wells of creativity that they have, that's where we're going to solve problems. Because that's where we get in touch with the oldest part of our nature and our greatest link to nature.
Really well put. Very inspiring. It helps me suss the big picture out, Brian. Thank you. And it also is like evoking a lot of McLuhan stuff. He called it rear view mirrorism. We go forward looking in the rear view mirror. But he did talk about the new nature, and he talks a lot about how we need new myths, new metaphors, new nature, and that we can turn breakdowns into breakthroughs, that you can flip a rejection into a redirection. And so let's go into for a second what first attracted you to writing and then filmmaking. Just go on those two forms. Like you started reading, and then you're reading books and you go, I can do that. So, you're watching Andy Griffith, you're seeing movies, and then you go, I can do that. What was the tipping point to kick you into I can do that for writing and filmmaking?
Okay, so when I was in college, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I didn't take the SATs. So I was going to go into the Air Force because I wanted to learn to fly, but then I was 4F because was born with a heart murmur. And then I was going to, my mom was going to talk to one of our neighbors who was a regional manager at McDonald's and see if I could get into the assistant manager track. But then my best friend's dad, who was a preacher, I told you about him before, he told my mom that I had a lot of raw talent and that he could help me get into one of these right-wing or evangelical religious schools. So I went to Gerry Falwell's college for my undergrad and Liberty University. And while I was there, I quickly abandoned whatever brush I had with organized religion. But I stayed there and I studied philosophy, and I was basically privately trained because I was the only philosophy major. And then when I was done, I thought, well, I love philosophy so much, but I hate this private school. I hate this religious school. So I'm going to apply to go to a secular school. And my advisor really wrote me a glowing recommendation, and I was accepted to Yale Divinity School to study philosophy for a master's. But then at the last minute, I was going into the bathroom as the guy who lived next to me was coming out, and he was like, he made some kind of funny thing like, ooh, you're graduating next week. What are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm going to go to Yale Divinity School and get my master's in philosophy. And I said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm going to film school. And when he said that, it was like a bomb went off in my head. I had been making videos my whole life, ever since my parents had a video camera when I was like 6 years old. And I had won some awards in high school for the best videographer, but no one ever came up to me and said, you could have a career or you could have a life making videos or making films. And I don't know why it never dawned on me, but I never had any encouragement whatsoever in that way. And so when he said that, I went in and I just remember I was under the shower and it just, the water just poured off of me, and it felt like ectoplasm just going down through my hands. And it felt like my body, the way that it was, and my mind, the way that it was before he said that, completely melted away. And I walked out of there and I said, I want to go to film school. And the only reason why I really wanted to go to film school was because I wanted to make a documentary about Eden Abez, or Eden Abbey, who wrote the song Nature Boy. And I wanted to make a documentary about Brian Wilson's bedroom tapes, the music that he made after he had gone into a mental institution several times. And that was the only thing that I really wanted to do. I had spent a lot of my time in college either reading Nietzsche or listening to Eden's Island and Nature Boy and Smile and Pet Sounds and and also the birds. And I wanted to go to film school, and then also I really wanted to move to Los Angeles. Those two things became super important to me, and so I just said, forget all this religious stuff, forget all this philosophy stuff. I'm just going to go to art school and be creative. And so at the time, Columbia University had, and NYU also, they had these 1-year intensives where you could go there and as a non-matriculated student, and then you could apply to get into the master's, or you could just use it as a professional school. And so like Alfonso Ribeiro was there from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. He was one of my classmates. And we had some other ones. But when I was in film school, I loved learning about lighting and foot candles and composition and all that. But when we had all these theory classes and they were talking about how stories are to be structured, and then you would have these teachers critiquing our films and telling us what correct storytelling is, I just wanted to kill myself. And I said, I got to get out of here and just go to Los Angeles. And when I was there, I quickly realized that films take a long time to make and get funded. And so Dominic, my friend who I mentioned earlier, who you also know very well, he was a writer, and there were certain things that I wanted to read that I was asking him to write, and he wouldn't write them because he had other projects. So I said, well, I'll write it. And I just back-ended into it because I wanted to get some stuff out there quickly, and films take a long time. And I wanted to read these articles and no one else wrote them. So I said, well, I guess I have to write them if I want to read them. And so I was not really intending to be a writer, but I was definitely intending to be a filmmaker. And then over time, I found that the documentaries that I was making or working on in LA, I didn't have final cut. So if you don't have final cut on the project that you're working on, then your project's a joke. And I realized that my projects that I worked on for BBC and PBS and some collaborations I did with Dominic and David Lee for Showtime, they were all a joke, and that I needed to do things where I had totally creative control. And that's when I started my own magazine. And that's when I got the book deal for Pop Surf Culture. That's when I started creating those live slideshows that I did at Sponto with you. And I just really took control of my creative destiny, and I put filmmaking aside for a while. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but
well, that was a great story, Brian. You really told me a lot. But just to say, the magazine was called Dumb Angel.
Yeah, Dumb Angel magazine.
Yeah, and I got it. Go ahead.
No, the book was called Pop Surf Culture. I did both of those as collaborations with Dominic Priori.
Yeah. And I don't want to go off, but I just dying to know, because you go from theology to film. The icon of that is Terrence Malick. Are you a Terrence Malick freak? Do you like all his work, or has he touched you in that transfer from theology, philosophy into filmmaking, or he hasn't really touched you? Just real short and brief.
I like the one where the dinosaurs come up in the middle of the movie. It has Brad Pitt, and he's like an asshole.
Tree of Life. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
When the dinosaur puts its foot on the neck of that smaller creature and then hears a sound and then runs away, to me that was one of the most beautiful things I ever saw in cinema. But I don't know anything else that Terrence Malick did, unfortunately.
Don't worry, that's all right. That's all right. I just wanted to make sure you knew at least something. But
I love that.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Well put. That whole story you told was amazing. So a screenwriting teacher actually told me once that great film, great art, great book is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Stanley Kubrick says the opposite. Great film, great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process?
Well, I'm not somebody who's really all that enamored with process. I like to leave it behind and let the final thing speak for itself. Um, but uh, the idea is everything to me. And when I get an idea, it doesn't always come in one flash. Sometimes it comes in stages, and sometimes it comes when I least expect it. But the idea dictates everything for me. So, but I don't consider it to be an egotistical process. I consider it to be a transcendental process whereby things reveal themselves rather than me egotistically trying to create. I do run into some problems with that. Some people that I collaborate with actually think that I'm overly controlling. Um, and I can go to the mat for an idea um, if I really feel strongly that that's what the thing is saying to me. But the big premium that I put on creativity is waiting for something to reveal itself and then staying true to it and not compromising that vision. Well, it's almost like a mystic vision. Once you have it, you have to stay true to the vision.
Yeah.
And being creative for me is like a mystic vision.
Yeah.
Every time I do something, I feel that I do go into something of a trance state, and then coming out of it is, it's a process to come out of it.
And Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of the audience when you're writing the book or creating the film?
Not at all.
Yeah.
I only think of what it is that the idea is telling me, what's being revealed. But, after I finish something that I've done in a way that is true to the idea, then I'm like a rabid dog about promotion and marketing. If somebody took it out of my hands before it had the ability to generate in a way that was really true to the idea, then I would just walk away and forget it. But if I can do something that's really true and I have total creative control over it, then I will go to the ends of the earth to get that product out to the world.
Well put. What do you think the motive of the cave artist was? Not what Herzog says or anthropologists, just your hunch. What do you think the motive of the cave artist was?
To extend what is in nature to the realm of what is unseen. So the cave artist is recognizing nature as a potential gateway to transcendence. And through the creative act, which is its own kind of trance state, the cave artist is able to access the transcendental realm.
Dude, that sounds like Gary Snyder said, my task as a poet entails the work of seeing the world without language and then bringing that seeing into language. What's more fundamental, language or music?
Well, they're both languages in their own way, but music is a much more abstract language, and it's probably much closer to the rhythms of nature. Words are very, very limited in their ability to express in a one-to-one way. Whereas I feel like, rarely does someone say something that makes another person cry or makes another person have this sort of visceral bodily reaction, like dancing or running down the hallway screaming in horror. Music evinces that, every day of every minute that somebody's listening to it. It has a real visceral effect on us, on our moods. So language has its limitations. I'm a writer, and I recognize that. And my goal actually as a writer is to say things in as few words as possible. And I would like to believe that by the end of my life, I could say what I want to say in just one word.
Nice. That's Joyce did it. You don't have to read Finnegan's Wake. You just read one word, laugh tears. He took as, A and S, stuck it, which is metaphor, as. He just stuck those two letters in the word laughter and created the human condition. You laugh and you cry, laugh tears. You don't have to read Finnegan's Wake. Just read one word. It's the DNA. You know, but that was beautiful. What's the function of music?
Well, I think the function of music is to create a liminal space between nature and the spiritual world, or the spiritual realm. Musical instruments have always had have always brought with them the possibility of being magic objects that transport us from one state of consciousness to the other. And also they can be very politically destructive, or they can tear down regimes, as in the case of the Pied Piper and his flute. In the beginning, it becomes something that can actually alleviate pain, his flute song. But once they take advantage of him and fail to respect his wishes for what he wants to be compensated with, he then takes away all the children from the town of Hamelin. Pan and the pan flutes in The Wind and the Willow, the people who actually hear the pan flutes being played don't remember where they came from before, where they were before. They're completely transported to another state of existence, and they don't remember their previous incarnation. In a way, that's almost like a Western version of death and reincarnation. We only hear faint echoes of the information that gets passed down. But an echo is enough to rebuild an entire, utopia or imaginary world. I think Joyce actually said that about Ulysses, that if you read, if the whole Dublin got destroyed, you could actually rebuild it just by reading Ulysses.
That is so cool. I love it. Okay, what's more important, Brian, conviction or compromise? I know it's a binary and you don't want to go there, but just off the top of your head.
Conviction.
With
the
what?
idea is everything, and staying true to the idea. If you don't do that, then your project is a joke.
Yeah.
Conviction.
And you've accomplished a lot. How do you rate these three elements? Luck, skill, and ambition. What played the biggest role, second and third?
Well, in Buddhism, we always say you can't attain enlightenment without desire. But desire will also eat you up if you have too much of it. So ambition is probably the thing that you need to start being creative. But to have a long and successful career, you got to have good luck, and also, as Kenny Rogers saying, you got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them.
Song lyrics are the best, aren't they? And so, you nailed it, because the question used to be, is ambition based more on fear or joy? I got that from Christine McKenna. That's one of the first questions I started with 35 years ago. And it's really a great question. But then I changed it because of William Friedkin. He said, in Hollywood, skill and luck have nothing to do with it. It's all ambition, which is, it's a debatable subject, blah, blah, blah. You really nailed that. Good. So, yeah, go ahead.
Gerry, I would not consider myself like a skillful or a talented person, and I really always learn the minimum, and I'm not great about details. I really champion revelation and the idea. And then I think the best thing is that I really pride myself on being very, very hungry. So ambition is, pretty much the ultimate.
It's not it's a beautiful thing. It doesn't, some people even have said, I won't take any of those. I call it necessity, but it's beautiful how people process these questions. There's no right or wrong answers. It's just like,
Right.
The roller coaster to see how they process them. Like this one, T.S. Eliot said that poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in?
Music. What really brings my inner dialogue out a lot is touch with another person, and acts of kindness. I fall to pieces when I see people, especially people who we are told are enemies, are able to find common ground. In scientific terms, I love the Venn diagram, and I always look for bridges. I don't like to dismiss somebody because of their politics or their spirituality. I don't have the modern liberal scientific positivist outlook where I dismiss people of a spiritual nature. I used to really be negative about people that talked in a new agey or spiritual kind of way. But then I realized that if I was going to be a happy person, that I would have to take any limitations off my mind. And so I don't really put any limitations on any kind of thinking, especially creatively. So,
we call that suspended judgment. And if you can, well, McLuhan nailed it. Understanding is not having a point of view. So you can go in your lonely teenage room and go, I hate Facebook or I love Facebook. But when you're with one or more people, you try to suss out how Facebook has changed our behavior. So you don't, if you take a point of view and say, oh, no, blah, blah, blah. So this is fun. Indeed, what Moshe Feldenkrais said is amazing. He works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength rather than we're taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness that you've turned into a strength.
Well, I'm an introvert. And I grew up around 3 extroverts, my two parents, and my brother. And it was really crippling when I was a little kid. I felt extremely socially awkward. And then even in my household, I was always really envious of the fact that they got so much energy from being outside and around people. And I always felt so fatigued by it. And I determined that my extreme anxiety about being in public places or being social, I don't even know how I did this, but when I was about 8 years old, I just determined that I was going to overcome it. And I told myself that I was going to put myself in a public situation every day until I stopped feeling awkward. And it was so hard. It actually took me about 6 years before that happened, but I would just force myself every day to have a conversation with somebody where I would wanted to go home. And that was like one of the biggest achievements I had as a kid, like being able to feel comfortable talking to people when it was my natural inclination to go and hide. Now it's still there in the back of my mind. I'm not totally comfortable in public situations, and I feel more energized just being in my creative lair and having all my stuff around me. And You know, I don't even, if I didn't have to like leave my, studio to go to the bathroom, I always wish I had a sink in my bathroom that I could just, or in my studio that I could just pee in.
That's smart.
But I have really adapted, and to me, that was one of the big accomplishments of my young life. And I still have fears of rejection. I still have a lot of, just basic fears that come up when projects are working, or when I'm dating someone new or meeting someone. There's all these variables. Every time you walk out the door, there's danger. But the Rinpoche, the guru that I study under, he often talks about how fears can become your great friends. They can actually be your greatest teacher. And at first I always thought it was kind of idiotic, like, oh, I have this crippling fear about this or that. Come on, crippling fear. And then it's like you do that and it becomes the worst feeling ever. But actually, once you start to really quiet your mind and become aware of your fears, you actually do learn a lot from them. And the one thing that I've learned more than anything from my fears is that I'm a lot stronger than I thought I was. I've actually survived many, many things in my life, including open heart surgery at the age of 34 and rehab at the age of 36. And other things big and small, and we all have, but I think those in particular taught me a lot about my strength and resolve. And I was able to carry those lessons that were learned from near-death experiences into my creativity, where the feeling of rejection, or the feeling of fear, or the feeling of being unheard, or the feeling of that something is going to take more energy or more concentration than I thought, is now something that I feel a little bit more equipped to handle. And so I did really learn a lot from those hardships and those difficult experiences, probably more than I did from my joyous experiences. But that's not to say that I would invite those kind of experiences on a day-to-day basis. I'd rather be happy.
Yeah.
I
respect your courage. It inspires me, Brian. Thank you. You really articulate, and I appreciate how you're succinct with communicating these ideas to me. It gets to me deeply. And it also evoked the McLuhan line, carefully make plans, then do the opposite. That's risking isn't easy. It's so easy to live in our comfortable world, So anger can be a productive emotion when fill in the blank.
When you use it as information.
Wow.
We all.
Oh, go ahead.
No. You.
No, finish your thought. I got a next question. That's fine.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna say, we all have anger, and it's just a feeling like any other feeling. It's really what we do with the anger.
Yeah. Yeah. Is perception reality?
It's just as real as anything else that we call real, and I'm not sure that we could tell the difference anyway.
Yeah.
I do, as a practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism, believe that there are plenty of illusions and distractions that will keep you from following your inner light. This is called the Bardo state in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but it's something that a lot of modern Tibetan Buddhist gurus actually recognize as something that we experience on a day-to-day basis. These kind of distractions, these kind of monsters or demons that are basically masquerading around as desires and things that take our attention away from what is really important. What is really important is following your inner light. And on this album that I produced, there was a song called "The Fire of the Soul," written by Abbey, which was actually about that very same subject, which is that there are plenty of things that can keep us from following our inner light. But as David Lynch wrote in Twin Peaks, what is it, the line about fire walk with me, one way out between two worlds, fire walk with me. And I think a lot of people have interpreted that, maybe correctly, I don't know, as this idea that somehow there's something demonic or satanic that's following people around, and fire has this sort of negative, Judeo-Christian resonance to it. But I always thought of it more in the Buddhist sense of like, there's only one way out between these two states that we're living in, and that is for your fire or your inner light to walk with you. And that's the way out of these existences, or that's the way out of the karmic cycle. Or in a sense, if you don't want to go with the spiritual mumbo jumbo version, the way out of our problems is just to follow the light.
Yeah. Leonard Cohen nailed it. He says, in every crack, there's, every crack lets in a little light, I mean, yeah, it's really well put. And I love how you pronounce Bardot, because it reminded me of a line I usually throw in by Bridget Bardot, who says, when I make love, I don't think. When we were talking about feeling and thinking, it's like, good luck. How do you not think when you're making love? You want to surrender to the sensual experience, but your brain's still like thinking, and you're like, don't think, just feel.
Yeah.
So if you were walking down the street today, Brian, and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
Lighten up. You're going to do good things.
That's good. The perfect through line from the fire talk to lighten up. Tell me something good you never had and you never want.
Something good that I never had and I never want. Caviar.
Great answer. I have fed the homeless for years in Venice, but I eat with them too, and we get a lot of great food. I mean, these people bring in, and the first time I ever ate caviar was feeding the homeless in Venice, because somebody brought us caviar. I goes, this is true living. I never went to some fancy restaurant or party.
Yeah, no, I don't go for that kind of pretentious thing myself either. I really live in a ghost world, I would say. I spend, most of any time I go out to eat, it's at an old restaurant that can kind of transport me into another mode of thinking. And but I would eat caviar with you if I had that same experience of
right there in the Rose parking lot, where we've shown 5 movies on the homeless there. What an amazing, Amy Semple McPherson, Captain Beefheart meets Lenny Bruce there. Frank Zappa played at the club. You taught us the history of the Cheetah Club. It's all right there. It's like the vortex of the universe. So if you were in a vat of vomit up to your neck and someone threw a bag of shit at your face, what would you do?
I have no idea how to answer a question like that. I would, knowing myself, I would just keep clawing. Vat of puke and shit be damned, I'm going to survive.
Yeah. Keep clawing, like CLAW.
Yeah.
What a word. Keep clawing. That sounds like a new age bumper sticker we could sell millions about.
I have Easy Does It here in my apartment.
Nice.
The old hippie bumper sticker from the 70s. I love that one.
Yeah. Here's a great bumper sticker. The worst things in life are free. That's one of my favorites. But you know a Scoop Nisker?
No. Is that a
Oh,
person?
dude, you got to catch Scoop Nisker. He's the Buddhist comedian from the 60s who had worked with Paul Krasner, and he's still around. And he does stand-up comedy at Buddhist centers. Good.
Wow.
Fine. Oh no, I've showed him, millions of movies my whole life, curating, and one of my regular viewers came up to me once and I showed a Scoop Nisker like comedy video. It's just a video of him doing his stand-up. He goes, "That's the best movie you ever showed." No, and the point is, he says a great line. If you don't like the news, go out and make your own. It's like it's a no-brainer. Just do. So we're winding down. This has been truly enlightening. I'm going to ask you one more, and then we'll bring Clinton in. In Joseph Beuys, the artist, who happened to say, "I can write my own chapter of Finnegan's Wake," that? He says, "I'll write my own." He said, "Make the secrets productive." Lou Welsh, this guy? He was a beat poet and an ad man. How's this for beat poetry? Raid kills bugs dead. That's raid kills bugs dead. 4 words, but he's a beat poet and an ad man. He said, guard the secrets, constantly reveal them. But it was another Wakian, Thornton Wilder, 1928. He said, art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time. Now, it's a cute little philosophy thought. I'm not implying by asking this question, I don't mean to imply that you haven't. You've laid your cards on the table for 90 minutes. But what's it really all about for you, Brian?
Well, to quote Eden Abbey, whose work I've been, producing in documentary and archival music form for 15 years now, money isn't everything and time isn't real. What is important is the way that you feel. Yeah. And I would say that that's true for me as well. The priority at the end of the day is to get something out of life.
Yeah. What a beautiful word, feel. That is it, man. Amazing. Clinton, what a joy to see your face pop in. Now, this guy's really touched on a lot of our themes here, right? Okay, yeah. Clinton, what do you got there, Clinton?
Well, first of all, just because you've been hinting at him this whole time, I'm really interested. That was a great quote from Eden Abbey, but I'd like to know more. What about him as an artist? I looked into a little bit. What is it that grabbed you about this musician from the earlier 20th century?
So when I was 18, I was like a big Beach Boys fan, and I was particularly into the psychedelic Beach Boys. And a friend of mine named Bob Haynes, who wrote for some fanzines, he gave me a picture of Eden with Brian Wilson in the studio during the Smile sessions. And then he introduced me to a historian named Dominic Priori, who came up earlier. And Dominic and I were able to kind of put some pieces together about Eden's life. But to answer your question more directly, I don't come from a cultural background. I never went to a museum as a child. I didn't have a world-class education. So I was not familiar with philosophers or poets or artists. If I was going to be introduced to something of a profound nature, it was either going to be through the church, which my family didn't go to. It was going to be through movies and television, or it was going to be through music. And I worked at a record store for 2 years during my high school time. And so records came my way that had just a massive impact on me. But there was nothing like the experience of Eden's Island from 1960 and hearing lines like, "And in the lonely chanting of the sea, I heard the echoes of eternity," or "I am the wind, the sea, the evening star. I am everyone, anyone, no one." Those touched me in a way that was, it gave me a sense that the world is so much bigger than we really know. And yet at the same time, it came through the perfect medium that somebody from my background would have been familiar with. It was a record. And I put this record on, and I had a real transcendental experience from this record. And I never had an experience like that in my life. So it was like a religious epiphany for me. And I just said, who is this guy? I want to know who he is. And so Dominic, he produced a CD version because he was much more experienced than I was at that time. He produced a CD version of Eden's Island. And then I asked him after that, I said, are you going to continue to do anything on this guy? And he said, no, I'm working on this book about the Sunset Strip in the mid-60s. And he gave me his blessing. And, 26 years later, I'm almost finished with my documentary. And I just produced this album, Eden's the Library of Congress, for 60 years. And so we basically, myself and 9 of Eden's friends.
Oh, darn.
Eden jumped in there. Brian, you sort of zipped out a little, but hopefully you'll jump back in. But that was a beautiful question. Oh,
okay.
Yeah. Anyway, Brian, you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, good. Yeah, you jumped out a little there, but I think it was Eden sort of coming in through the cosmos. He sort of like shut you down for a second. But it was really beautiful that Clinton asked, because it is, we know the details, but it was what was deeper in Eden that touched you, and you articulated that well,
Yeah, he's my guru from the other side. Since I did go to college, and since I have had the experience of living in Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York, I have been exposed to a lot more philosophy and spirituality. But Eden, through popular music, through Nature Boy and through Eden's Island and through the work that he left behind, he was able to kind of reach me at a level that was different than an intellectual level. There was something from my childhood about it. There was something simple and direct, and yet my feeling was like, if he could do it, coming from the background that he had and working in the pop medium, then I could reach that same level of transcendence, where other people that I knew, they were just a bit more advanced and outside of the experience that I had. So I really related to Eden in that way, because he just seemed like somebody that came from a very similar background as mine. And I really admire the journey that he made and the work that he laid down on tape. And so I've spent a long time studying it and working through it and getting it out there, resurrecting a lot of his lost utopias that he left on the shelf. And so,
yeah, that's amazing. So they were stored in the Library of Congress, but I guess as far as like commercial releases go, that it's sort of been your job sort of to pull them out and get them accessible to the public. That's a great mission.
Yeah. I started in 2014. I released an LP called The Exotic World of Eden Abbey. And that was just all of the Exotica singles that he had put out in the 1950s that predated Eden's Island. And then I did another one for Bear Family Records that kind of took it into the 60s. And then I wanted to basically work on this project that I felt was like, had the possibility of actually having a conversation with him and creating something from just the sheet music. I had all these contacts that knew him and played with him in the 60s and 70s, and one of them still had his handmade drums and flutes. So I thought, what a great act of magic or of conjuring to actually work with his instruments, work with his sheet music, work with the people who knew him and worked with him to bring this unrealized song suite to life. And so that was really thrilling. It was like having a conversation with Eden. That, you know, it was really one of the most beautiful and unbelievable creative experiences I ever had in my life. And I was equally energized and broken by the experience time and again.
Yeah, I'm sure. Absolutely. Sounds very transcendent, of course. And it seems like a lot of your philosophy has been built up, in pursuit of this sort of renewal of catharsis. That line from Eden that you quoted there, about the feeling is all we have.
Oh yeah, money isn't everything and time isn't real. What is important is the way that you feel.
What is important is the way that you feel. Yeah. It seems like um, I I'd like to know, because McLuhan's got this great idea, and I'm all about McLuhan. He's got this great idea that with electricity and the telegraph and the instantaneity of electronic media, we enter a discarnate state. It's so much easier to live outside of even your body, where you're at, when you're involved entirely through your senses, invested within music or invested within television, sure, but just this very ability to exist within the ethereal sounds and senses, which your body's got nothing to do with. And I'm wondering if that resonates at all with this idea of the spiritual realm, or these transcendent liminal spaces that you seem to find yourself so freely entering into and coming back from.
Yeah, so I think that humans have always been creating a kind of virtual space that augments the natural world. I think we've always needed, in some psychological and instinctive way, to transcend our own limitations and experience the transmigration of souls, whether it's through animals or whether it's through the imagination into realms that we are not able to experience around us, but only within us. And so I think virtual reality, though I agree with McLuhan, it's certainly, our media has certainly broadened our ability to create that kind of virtual state in which we can all participate in. Art and the imagination in general, whether it's literature or whether it's cave paintings or whether it's Gothic manuscripts, they have always had this virtual aspect to them, where icon paintings, particularly in the Eastern Christian tradition, where they have actually called upon the viewer to go into a kind of trance state where they can take the outline of information and then activate something of the virtual experience in their own mind. So, technology that we have today, it's impressive in its photorealism, but, as I quoted Robertson Jeffers before in one of my favorite poems, man is no more changed in 10,000 years than the beaks of eagles. And I think that that's really true. Our psychological state is still in its early evolved, in its evolved state. So
I think, yeah, absolutely. I think McLuhan would agree with you insofar as the printing press was like a short 500-year detour into this hyper-logical, mechanistic feeling, which would be numb to the transcendent, so to speak. And so television and whatnot is just bringing back what had, for a blip of history, been suppressed when everyone was reading so many books. They were lost in linear thinking, right? That sort of deal.
Yeah, and I mean, I actually did my master's in art history on Gothic art, that was German Gothic art that came in the aftermath of Gutenberg's invention. And so, I actually got to spend time at the Metropolitan Museum holding some of those old woodcut blocks, and you just see that there was thousands and thousands of imprints made on them. It's really an amazing object. But the dissemination of information has definitely allowed the kind of bonding experience that would open up our knowledge of the things that we share. I think that it was difficult to share that kind of information before the printing press. And so it was much easier for, I don't know, somebody who was practicing something very, very local, like, say, witchcraft or herbology, to then suddenly be confronted with this thing that comes from Rome, from an establishment far off, that they are now learning that they have, basically been practicing, quote unquote, the wrong thing. When, basically they've just been doing what they've been doing locally for such a long time. So, that mass communication, it's allowed us to understand the things that we share at a deeper level, but I think it's also allowed us to homogenize culture in a way that has actually pitted one culture against the other. And for me, that's the one thing that my work really rails against. And I think that's the thing that Abbey's work is really in protest of, is the homogenization process of media. So
I agree. Down with homogenization.
But it is, the beauty is there, again, what I learned from Zappa is embracing contradiction. So if we study the three forms of communication: spoken word, printed word, and electronic word, we know there's gesture involved in all of them. We've communicated with spoken word this evening together, but it's actually, the hidden ground was electricity. Tom Waits says, the best music doesn't want to be recorded. I asked Charlie Hayden who wrote "Oh Joe Clark," because he quotes it in the middle of an Ornette Coleman song. He goes, nobody wrote it. And so music's carried on like, old stories, bards, just repeating these things, and they get carried on. And we are able to carry on Eden's music through someone like you, dedicated to getting it back in a form that we hear electronically. And it's grounded in beautiful, warm music, and you just listen to your people can watch clips of your film on YouTube, and you hear his music. It reeks of the warmth of analog, but we're hearing it through a digital medium because digital's gotten better. So that hidden ground of electricity is very interesting. And your question was great, Clinton, because it brought up some of these themes that we constantly explore. And it is back to McLuhan saying we need new myths, new metaphors, new questions, and we need to flip what we think we know. We need to unlearn what we know. We need to rethink or reinvent constantly. So,
we don't need no education.
But we don't. We
don't need no thought control. But we often also can confuse the container for the thing which is contained. And so it's really about the ideas. It's not about the technology or the form of media. It's about the thing that's being said. And when you talk about Eden's music, that's the most important thing. People really get caught up in whether Nat King Cole or a crooner is singing it, or whether Eden's Island is being played in the exotica form. And people who find these things, they say, oh, why did he work in that, sort of ersatz tropical world music thing after he had done this kind of almost classical thing with this, African-American crooner or whatever. Or why do the songs sometimes sound so extreme with these flutes, and why do they sound so, kitschy with these poems on them? And I always say, it's not really about the format or the container. You know, you have all these critics and academics that are saying, you know, there's some kind of critical standard, something's 4 or 5 stars or something's canonical. But I don't actually really put any kind of stock into that. I don't really believe that there is any kind of standard that things are defaulting back to. We talked about that earlier. And in the case of Eden's music, I don't think he was concerned with writing critically profound melodies or whether his exotica had jazz grooves. I think he was trying to create pictures that allowed you to have an experience, you know. And in one of the interview quotes that I have with him that's in my films, he says, I have things I want to say. Now that's the most important thing that I think an artist can understand, is that it's not about the container, it's not about the genre, it's not about the style, it's not even, you know, about like the groove or the melody. It's about what you want to say. You know, who cares about all that other stuff? I mean, you can adopt things that have a provocative or controversial or anachronistic sheen to them, and that might be a way of drawing people in, and that's fine as long as you're not doing it for marketable reasons. As long as that anachronism is giving somebody like a total experience of something that will draw them in, that will confuse the shit out of them, that will provoke them, that will make them feel anything, then hey, look, the surface part is great, but ultimately it doesn't matter if you don't have something to say. And I think that's the thing that is most important to me about Eden. And when I put his music out, particularly the Dharmaland album, it was not necessarily to create nice orchestrations or to create things that sounded like 1961, even though the music was written in 1961. It was to produce something that made you feel something, that said something that could heal people or provoke people. You know, that was the intention of it. I made it as an album of protest against all of the Disneyfication of every urban space around the world now, where they all look the same. You know, it's like life has become too expensive for people, and you know, we're fed all of this garbage, like, you know, high fructose corn syrup and all this like pasteurized and homogenized shit. And it's like, you know, here is something that says you don't have to live like that. And in fact, living like that, it's insane. Why do we put up with something like that? You know, and I think the other thing about the album, and I think the other thing about Eden's music, is it really trusts you. He's saying you can be trusted to self-sacrifice. You can be trusted to love your fellow man. You don't need to be told what to buy, what to eat, what to think. You don't need to have something drilled into your head that this is the proper way to speak or talk. You are trustworthy. You are made of spiritual stuff, and so is everybody else. And you can find commonality with them. You know, that's the line. The greatest thing you'll ever learn is just to love and be loved in return. You're not going to get that from advertising and products and clothing and cars and all the things that we're taught that we need. You get it from being open to the possibility that anything can happen at any time, and from giving it all away. And I think that's what Eden was really about. And you know, the funny thing is, your favorite line that I said, money isn't everything and time isn't real, what is important is the way that you feel, actually was a song that was called The Gas House, and Eden wrote it about the coffee house in Venice, California in 1960.
Wow. I was going to say, that's beautiful. That last little rant there, Brian, really summed up things. It was like, that's a great summary. But a couple things, because I want Clinton to come to Venice, California someday and go along the boardwalk. In the great old blue mansion that's still on the boardwalk, didn't Eden rent a room there? Because I constantly tell people that, because you told me that once. Is that true? he rented a room. It's this it's right next to the Charlie Chaplin
Yeah.
building.
No, he lived there. A friend had that place.
Yeah.
And stored his vibraphone there.
Right. And he
And
lived there for a while.
Well, he lived in the backyard.
Yeah. He lived in the backyard. That's even better.
In the big room. That's what he said. He lived in the big room.
And guess what, Clint? You'll love this. Eventually, when Snapchat started, that was their first building office when they invaded Venice.
Oh, no.
Still, now you used to, like, they'd bust the homeless for sitting on the steps because Snapchat cops wouldn't let him sit on the steps. Now my friend sits there and smokes cigarettes all day and talks about Phil Oakes and Lenny Bruce, and it's like, it's back to old Venice. It's so cool. But what you said was, again, this difference between rooted and retro. I find, you can release stuff from the past and act in a retro kind of way. But what you're doing is you're rooted in that. Eden is offering something that is timeless, and it is applicable to us all, no matter how we embrace it or consume it, and someone jumping on YouTube and watching Eden for 5 minutes from one of the clips you've edited is they're going to be able to experience that like we would go, oh, I want a vinyl album to put it on, or I want a feature film, or however. But it's McLuhan updated his aphorism, the medium is the message, or the medium is the massage, mid-career to the user is the content. So it's interesting how you're talking about, it's more about, we know that both the form and the content are important, but we tend to grab the content only and not understand that the form is affecting our experience. And that's what McLuhan was saying, is that both are important, but I'm going to overemphasize the form so that you'll pay a little attention to it. And in a way, that's the flip. You first brought, it's like we live life walking forward, but in order to understand it, you have to walk backwards. You have to flip things. And so I always flip AI. You were talking about virtual reality so well. Brian, you were bringing this in artificial intelligence. So you take the A and the I and you flip them to IA, and it's integral awareness. That's what Marshall was about. He was flipping AI before it took us over to IA. Integrate everything and become aware of the big picture by studying the patterns.
Yeah.
So anyways, we're going to close out now, and we could continue on forever. There's so much more to talk about, and we really appreciate your time. And I thank you both. Just in closing, we'll ask Brian, what gives you the most optimism?
Simple acts of kindness. The fact that some diners are still open, and the love that I share between friends like yourself. If any of that disappeared, I think I would want to call it a day. But just the fact that I have the ability to have conversations like this, the ability that I've been able to create for my entire adult life, mostly doing the things that I want and that I love, and that I'm surrounded by so many wonderful, creative people. That gives me so much hope, and I realize that I'm very lucky to have had the experiences that I have, and so I hope that in the work that I produce, it's able to magnetize out that same kind of love and feeling of being able to overcome through creativity and through connection. So I know it sounds a little bit hippy dippy, but
dude, it sounded great. You've been very articulate. Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you, Clinton.
Oh, my pleasure.
Love
thank
you guys.
All right.
Bye.